The Space Marines had a lot of very powerful anti-armor platforms, but pretty well none of them reached the sheer power, ferocity and raw numbers of a squad of Eradicators in melta range. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a review of the Eradicators in the new Codex, going over their rules and comparing their damage output, and a few of the nasty things that they can do with the new toys in the Codex, perhaps in particular the Firestorm Assault Force. The Eradicators are perhaps slightly infamous new models in the Space Marine line, dedicated anti-armor with melta rifles and gravis armor. When they launched in 9th edition, they became perhaps one of the most overpowered units in the game straight away. And even with further points changes and balance passes, they still remained one of the best tank hunting units for the Space Marines throughout 9th. In 10th edition things have changed a bit for them, they still seem to arguably spit out the very best numbers out of the Space Marine Codex if you can get them in close enough. The models themselves are £35, €45 and $60 from Games Workshop. As with quite a lot of their 3-model elite infantry type kits, these aren't seen as a particularly good deal in their range, and even packing powerful weaponry they still have a pretty bad points per dollar ratio of only 1.6. I feel like the miniatures are nice enough, basically Gravis Marines with melta weapons, can't go too far wrong with that, and the major options with the multi-part kit are to choose either enclosed helms or more bareheaded helms like this. The choice for whether or not to give 1 out of 3 of them a multi-melta, which in 10th edition you definitely should, and a few aesthetic changes that used to differentiate between melta rifles and heavy melta rifles, though in 10th edition Games Workshop removed the distinction, probably not the worst idea really. They do have an easy build version of the models floating around as well. They appeared in Indomitus, and you can still purchase those with the Honoured of the Chapter set, alongside some Blade Guardian characters. Might be worth looking into if you wanted those specific models as well. I would bear in mind that they don't come with the multi-melta, and they are a bit more monopose. They did also feature in the Salamanders Battle Force as well, out of production now, but that might be another way that some people got their hands on them. They are very fluffy for the melta and flame loving Sons of Vulcan. As ever, if you were looking to pick up some of these at a discount anyway, feel free to check out the channel's affiliate links down in the video description. They're 15% off at Element Games at just under £30, around about 20% off at Gap Games in Australia, and both of those can be a good way to save a bit of money compared with Games Workshop, as well as supporting Auspex Tactics and these videos. Getting into the rules though, and this is the datasheet for the Eradicator Squad, not massively changed since the index in any way, though I feel like they were already a unit that did what they did quite well. They're 95 points for a squad of 3, and you can take them in a squad size of 3 to 6. I think typically I'd be more tempted by 3s over 6s unless you're doing something like character buffs or you have specific stratagems that you want to use with them, but 6 isn't as bad as it used to be given that they can target different targets now and don't all have to focus fire. Their stat line is the Gravis Armor stat line. They move 5 inches, which does mean they're kind of slow, and they've got Toughness 6 with 3 wounds, a profile that's going to be quite resilient to small arms, but is going to go down really quite quickly to any sort of mid-strength plasma or melta fire, or dedicated anti-tank weapons very fast. Overall, I'd say they're not enormously durable for the points at that kind of cost. Obviously their main purpose is to bring their anti-tank melta rifles into battle and take aim at enemy battle tanks and monsters with them. I feel like quite a lot of melta weapons did get considerably more underwhelming in 10th edition given the shorter range and lower strength, though the crazy rerolls that the Eradicators get I still think makes them work quite well. At their base profile for a squad of 3, 2 members should take the standard melta rifles, a single shot each hitting on a 3+ at strength 9, AP 4 and damage D6, with melta 2 and heavy. The 18-inch range does mean that they're a lot harder to get into 9-inch melta range than they used to be. You can't just get them out of reserve anymore, though I suppose against some armies rapid ingress could be helpful. The third one in the squad should take a multi-melta. That's basically just gets you 2 shots at the same profile but hitting on a 4+ rather than a 3. Basically that's just extra firepower with no downside whatsoever. If you're getting the full rerolls against tanks and vehicles, then you average 1.5 hits with a multi-melta versus 0.88 with a standard melta rifle. An extra over 50% damage there, so it is basically auto-include at this point. If I were you, I'd probably kit bash one if you had some regular Eradicators with the standard melta rifles. It's not really too hard to make a weapon swap with a spare multi-melta you might have lying around. Finally, the heavy keyword for them, I feel like, is something that's just not really all that helpful on this unit. That's going to give them a +1 to hit if they can remain stationary, but I feel like they're a unit that's almost never going to be able to or want to do so. They're almost always going to have to move to get within 18 inches, and even if they are within 18 inches already, you might well want to move to get them within 9 inches, which is typically going to outweigh the advantage of a +1 to hit. I feel like if you had them arrive and then shoot an enemy vehicle, and then your opponent chooses to spend the next turn not engaging them in combat, but still leaving a vehicle within range for you to stand and shoot, then in some way your opponent's messed up a bit there. They should be a pretty high priority target once they have arrived, and certainly to make sure that they at least have to move to get those melters back in range. If you can deal with their close range though, their damage output is pretty immense. They're kind of a bit whatever against enemy elites, but against tanks, monsters and vehicles, they become really quite spectacularly reliable with those big shots. They get to reroll all hit rolls, all wound rolls and all damage rolls, compared with just their base profiles that's usually going to be a damage buff in excess of double. These are their average numbers at 18 inches and then 9-inch range. Kind of whatever against elite infantry, though not terrible. Around about 1 or 2 standard Space Marines killed, which isn't awful I suppose, but not great. Around about a 2/3 chance of penetrating a Terminator's armour and killing one of those, but then coming into their own really quite a lot against tanks and vehicles. 11 wounds to a Rhino, 4 wounds to a Maleceptor with a 4+ invulnerable save, and around 6 or 7 wounds to a Mighty Land Raider with toughness 12 and a 2+. They are a lot better against things that are relying on high saves but without an invulnerable. If you can deliver them to within 9-inch range though, then things get pretty crazy. Around about 16 wounds on average to a Rhino tank, which is fairly spectacular. With a damage reroll, you average at slightly over 6 wounds per successful hit, which is quite cool. On average it's 6 wounds to a Maleceptor, around about 1 failed save there, or around about 10 wounds to a Land Raider, usually 1 or 2 failed saves. Those raw numbers really are quite impressive. They do have a pretty reasonable chance to earn their points back in a single volley against armour without invulnerable saves, and potentially doing so even if they can't get within 9 inches. Just for a bit of comparison of those numbers versus other Space Marine anti-tank options, I thought I'd add them on to the table that I compared the Lancer versus Ballistus Dreadnought for the other day, just to highlight just how far ahead the Eradicators are. Gladiator Lancers are typically some of the best Space Marine anti-tank at long range, doing around about 10 wounds to a Rhino, or just under that to a Land Raider. If you get to an Eradicator squad within 18-inch range, then you pretty handily beat that on all the categories, bar against Terminators and things. Pretty spectacularly so against a toughness 9 Rhino if you've got something that their melta rifles wound on a 4+ or better. And then if you can get them into 9 inches, they go on absolute god mode, around about double the damage output on average of a Gladiator Lancer against the tougher targets. Nowhere near in the same league as anything else here, they obviously come with the big disadvantages of trying to get them there in the first place. These numbers are all weighted to 160 points just to compare units, and the Eradicators might do a little bit better as well if the enemy target had cover as well, given that they've got some of the best AP on this list. That kind of leaves us with the question as to how to get them there. I feel like depending on the opponent you do have a fair few fairly credible options. I think a single unit of 3 of them starting in strategic reserve is really quite a reasonable choice. It is quite disruptive if the opponent's got some big armoured targets. It means that if they want them not to be casually eradicated, they're going to have to screen these guys out to 18 inches, which could be kind of annoying for their army depending on how they're set up, and might be impossible for some armies like Knights. Probably wouldn't want to go too heavy on that tactic as it's going to have diminishing returns, but not too bad for 95 points, and you could maybe consider rapid ingress as well. If there did just happen to be a situation where you could deploy them somewhere safe where they're not going to get shot, and then threaten to move into melter range in the next turn, that could be kind of massive. Otherwise, you could start them on the board. That's definitely going to limit them really quite a lot more, as the opponent's going to know their threat range and whether or not they can keep their favourite units outside of it. Ideally, you'd want to have them clustering behind ruins somewhere. They don't really want to be taking a heavy anti-tank fire, as their durability is just not really all that great, and then can just threaten to pop out and ruin an enemy unit if they move them up to take midfield objectives or something. They've still got a 23-inch threat range between their movement and their melta rifles, and a bit better in things like Gladius or Firestorm, where they've got options for advance and shoot. Adding an extra d6-inch threat range onto that means they're a lot more credible for starting on the board like that. As a very scary close-range shooting unit, I feel like transports are again a very reasonable option for them. They can't ride in impulsors or drop pods or anything, and while you could put them on things like Storm Ravens or Land Raiders, I feel like probably the Repulsor or the Repulsor Executioner are the best bets. Fairly good tanks with good firepower in their own right. They move 10 inches, then disembark 3 inches out the front of it, and then they've got 18-inch range. So 31-inch threat range in theory up to their maximum range, or 22-inch threat range to be within melter range. Could be very nice with a repulsor as well, which can potentially threaten to jump them back in if the enemy tries to charge them. That could be very powerful. And transports are particularly awesome with the Firestorm Assault Force. I feel like the Eradicators are quite a nice unit for that. Otherwise, a couple of chapters have some slightly more exotic options as well. There's a fair few options that allow the Eradicators to basically teleport in as if from Deep Strike. The Deathwatch Teleportarium stratagem can teleport them about. Uriel Ventress can give them standard issue Deep Strike, much harder to screen than just on the edges of the board via Strategic Reserve. And the Blood Angels Librarian Dreadnought can also teleport them around with Wings of Sanguinius. Otherwise, beyond transport and setup options for unit support, they have plenty of other options, but I kind of feel like they're not really a unit that necessarily needs much more to make them work. Oath of Moment, I guess, could help if they happen to be targeting enemy elites rather than vehicles, though it's going to do nothing against their ideal prey. For more generic stratagems, Armour of Contempt is generally handy on Space Marines. I feel like sometimes it could make the difference between one or two of these surviving and the squad being wiped. Maybe not the worst option if the opponent's only got a limited amount of shooting that can take them down. Rerolling a wound roll from time to time could be alright against enemy elites if it's probably going to make the difference between killing one more model, I suppose. And as I mentioned, rapid ingress in the right situation could be kind of brutal if you can set them up somewhere safe and then have them in a position to move into melta range. For characters, they do have a fair few options that can join them. The Gravis Captain and the Apothecary Biologist are the main ones out of the core codex beyond chapter specific stuff. I feel like the Apothecary is perhaps the most interesting one given that he's just 55 points and he does actually directly help their shooting by giving them lethal hits. He helps out a bit with OC as well, and could even be a fairly reasonable unit to take the first damage when the unit gets counterattacked maybe, particularly if you get hit by damage 3 things that would kill individual aggressors. He could tank 2 of those shots before he goes down. I feel like characters aren't necessarily 100% necessary to make the squad work, though the Apothecary does add a bit of help. His lethal hits help out with an extra around about 12% damage buff against Terminators. I'd say that's really not that worth it in the scheme of things, but given that their melta rifles are only strength 9, he does help out really quite a lot against vehicles. Even though they have the advantage of re-rolling wound rolls, he helps out by around about an extra 17% against toughness 9 vehicles, a bit borderline worth there, but actually works out to be genuinely quite a good damage buff against T10 to T12 vehicles that you're wounding on 5s. An extra 35% damage boost there. I think it's probably not really worth it on a smaller squad, though maybe could be justified on a big one. Depends on whether or not you might consider that overkill though as well. If you're taking around about 250 points of units, they're probably going to kill one vehicle very dead. But if they can't reach a vehicle that's important enough for that, or the enemy screens them out of all big targets, then you might be a bit disappointed. If you really wanted to go whole hog as well, you could even take Fire Discipline in the Gladius Task Force. Their full hit rerolls means that you could be getting a whole ton of sustained and lethal hits. That could be fairly scary coming out of Deep Strike with Uriel Ventress's buff perhaps. Otherwise, the Gravis Captain is at least fairly cheap at 80 points, and he'd allow you a free battle tactic stratagem each turn. Could be nice maybe in the Firestorm Force for a +1 to wound maybe. Getting that for free is rather good, particularly with strength 10 melta weapons. You're probably going to be making your wound rolls there. Feels kind of fine, though I think that quite a lot of his value comes from his melee damage profile, and they're generally a squad that doesn't really want to be dashing into melee if they can help it. Maybe it doesn't hurt to round out the unit a little bit though. Otherwise, Ironfather Fyros actually makes them somewhat durable, giving them a 5+ feel no pain type save, while he's hopefully buffing vehicles as they march up the board perhaps. He does add some combat and a bit of shooting of his own too. Marnie's Calgar could give you advance and shoot for the unit all the time and fall back and shoot, though maybe it just feels like a bit of a bad fit for them given that he really wants to be in combat and the Eradicators generally don't. Torgaradon can give you Ignore's cover, which is maybe a little bit less exciting than lethal hits. Against some targets it's just not going to be relevant at all for the Eradicators, though I guess he does come with a bonus grav gun and some good melee against vehicles, I guess. Finally, Vulcan Hestan could allow you some big rerolls versus anything that isn't monsters or vehicles, can round them out a bit even if he doesn't join the squad, and as mentioned, Uriel Ventress can deep strike them, even though he doesn't join the unit himself. Detachments next, and as mentioned earlier, I feel like Eradicators are generally significantly better in a Firestorm Assault Force. Kind of appropriate, they should be good in the Salamander's detachment maybe. Strength 10 melters within 12 inches is pretty big, it makes them so much better against toughness 10 targets, and a lot better against T9 and Terminators too. Plus it's got the double whammy of giving them the assault keyword as well, really nice for getting them into melta range if you started them on the board. They're also pretty excellent out of repulsors, as they can use their transport shenanigans, perhaps some of the best out of any unit. They've got the option for that devastating one where you shoot the transport, then they get out and shoot you back, and they feel like one of the better units to use that +1 to wound for 1 CP. That's easily worth it if they're shooting against a toughness 11 or 12 vehicle. Definitely a unit to strongly consider for multiple reasons in that detachment. Otherwise, as shooty infantry, the Vanguard Spearhead does a lot for them as well. -1 to hit and cover are both good things at surviving the counter-strike, perhaps for a unit that's going to be turning up on strategic reserve and a bit further away from the core of the enemy army. It's kind of fine for start on the board as well. Otherwise, a 1 CP to return to reserves works pretty well to get a second alpha strike if necessary, and can get a +1 to hit if they're shooting outside of 12 inches, which they can generally quite comfortably do. That's particularly nice with the multi-melta. I guess you could even use things to reactive move or forward deploy with a character for an alpha strike maybe. I feel like locking them into the alpha strike though maybe isn't the best idea compared with other more general purpose units, where these guys are going to be a bit sad if there's no tanks to get their hands on. Otherwise, some nice options with the Gladius. Easy access to advance and shoot and fall back and shoot are both pretty excellent, and as mentioned they could use that fire discipline combo if you went with the Apothecary Biologist. The Stormlance Task Force has a 1 CP to advance and shoot and a 1 command point to reactive move 6 inches, both of those potentially helpful. The Anvil Force would be brutal with the potential +1 to wound, but in reality I think you'd usually struggle to set that up. I don't think most opponents are going to be allowing you to just stay stationary and blow away your tanks like that. They do have some nice options for sustained hits and fall back and shoot though. Finally, the Ironstorm Spearhead. I feel like you're generally more likely to take big gun tanks than Eradicators here. Maybe not awful for a surprise pop-out threat out of a Repulsor Executioner or a Repulsor though, and the single reroll that it gets really isn't too bad if you're taking out some elite infantry instead of vehicles. Finally, for synergies and things, the Divergent chapters have a fair few options. Blood Angels could teleport them around with a Librarian Dreadnought, perhaps one of the better options for that I guess. Black Templars get slightly boosted toughness with Feel No Pain, though no different to much of the rest of their units. Deathwatch as a ranged unit have a fair few handy buffs. Lethal hits and sustained hits on different turns both amp up their firepower. The teleportation stratagem could be another way to threaten a turn 1 alpha strike potentially, and you can field them in the Indomitable kill team, though I feel like they're just a little bit less exciting there, losing the huge melta rerolls that they get otherwise. The Dark Angels detachment has got some good situational stratagems, fall back and shoot, 1 command points for assault and ignores cover, and 1 command points to return fire if you take a casualty. Probably none of those are staples, but situationally alright, and perhaps the Space Wolves do some of the least for them. Still maybe not the worst to have some really dedicated anti-armor though, to back up some Thunderwolves with some 1,000,000 attacks that can take out lots of other things. Overall though, for 95 points I think they're really quite usable. They do spit out some of the best anti-tank damage in the Codex provided you can deliver them. Though as mentioned, compared with things like gun tanks it comes with a whole host of issues. They're slow and short range so they need some delivery, more investment compared with the other stuff. Not really all that tough per point, though small arms might struggle against them. Their damage output is very swingy depending on whether you get those hits through, and your opponent might choose to re-roll certain hits like invulnerable saves. That could make them struggle further against the targets that they're already a bit worse against. They're not very flexible, so won't really do anything at all against hordes, and are only okay against elites. And perhaps more than most things in the Space Marine army, they're vulnerable to being locked in melee, unless you've got something like the Tactical Doctrine to rescue them and fall back and still fire. Definitely a lot of downsides, but still, given all that, I think that there's still room for them in competitive lists. Just 1 unit thrown into strategic reserves could be a nice disruptive threat, and mounting them in a repulsor I think gets around quite a lot of the disadvantages otherwise, and is also quite a nice one to do a bit of anti-infantry firepower with to make them a bit more rounded for an overall offering. Certainly a unit that I could see using in the Firestorm Assault Force. Given the inflexibility though, I probably wouldn't go too heavy on these, maybe something like 3 to 6 in a 2,000 point army list, and back them up with things with fewer weaknesses and some more well-rounded damage profiles. Let me know your thoughts though. How well have the Eradicators been performing for you in 10th edition so far, and would you be tempted to run them in competitive lists? For your Space Marines now we've got access to all sorts of cool detachments. As always, looking forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.